It's 11 o'clock. We'll get started. Good morning and welcome to LPC's Building Outgoings review webinar. If you're new to our webinars, here's how we'll proceed. Our team of experts will provide an overview of building outgoings, share some sector-specific insights and strategies to help future-proof your lease, followed by a Q&A session at the end. Joining me today for the Outgoings review are Julian Kurath, who will provide the overview of and focus on office, Adrian Gerber, who's our specialist in all things retail, and Dylan O'Donnell, who will discuss the industrial sector. Moving on to the agenda, we'll go through the definition of outgoings, then we'll move on to gross versus net leases. We'll share some sector-specific nuances and then key takeaways. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end, but feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A function at any time. Questions are anonymous.
Thanks, Gillian. So let's first look at the definition of outgoings. We skip to the next page. Okay, outgoings or operating costs in a lease refer to the expenses associated with the day-to-day running of the building, excluding the rent itself. These costs are often shared among tenants, usually proportionately to the size of the leased space to that of the building or complex. The exact nature of these costs varies depending on the building and the lease agreement. The quantum of outgoings can vary and can be over $300 a square metre per annum for a CBD office building, so quite significant. Outgoings do not include costs incurred directly by tenants for electricity, cleaning, security, fire protection, and other running costs. So gross versus the net lease. To better understand outgoings specific to a lease, we need to first understand what type of lease it is. This table very briefly summarises the key differences between the key lease types, starting with net lease. In addition to the base rent, which is the net rent, the tenant is responsible for a proportion of building outgoings. The gross lease, which is where all outgoings are included in the grossed up rent. So they package up the net rent and the outgoings into one package. And another common, or probably the most common, is semi-gross lease. There are various types of semi-gross leases. What they all have in common is that something is payable in addition to the gross lease amount, whether it be council rates or more commonly, increases over a base year. That is, in addition to the grossed up rent, the net rent and outgoings, the tenant is also responsible for increases in the building outgoings over a base year, typically the year prior to the lease commencement date. We will talk you through an example of this shortly. In addition to these, there are multiple variations to net leases, including double net and triple net leases. Whilst we haven't covered these in the table, they generally apply to longer term leases for specialist uses, which allow the tenant greater control of building maintenance and can include capital upgrades being the responsibility of the tenant. There are pros and cons of each, and we'll summarise these now. So net leases, the pros, the landlord is motivated to maintain the building, given the cost is recovered from tenants. The con or negative is it's limited landlord motivation to reduce outgoings, and that's because the cost is recovered. And there's occasions where non-outgoings are recovered through outgoings, and there's a couple of examples of this we'll talk to a little bit later as well. In terms of the gross lease, the pros, landlord carries all the risks associated with the building outgoings, including the costs. And the negative or the con, the building maintenance may suffer because of increased cost to the landlord and therefore the landlord not wanting to maintain the building up to the standard required. In terms of the semi-gross lease, the pros, the landlord motivated to maintain the building in most cases. And the reason we say most cases is because they do vary in what's included and excluded. And the con can be a double recovery for the landlord and an increased risk on the tenant. So this table here is a simple example of the financial impact for semi-gross leases versus that of a net lease, and highlights the double up factor at play. The bars on the left indicate the net lease scenario with the base and or net rent component in blue and the outgoings component in yellow. Both assume 4% growth annually for the year 1 and 2, and then I've also shown the year 10. The 3 bars on the right indicate the semi-gross scenario, that is the grossed up rental in blue, being the net rent and the outgoings, grown annually by 4%. You'll note that the grossed up rent equals the net lease scenario, being the net rent and the outgoings. However, in the semi-gross scenarios, the bars on the right, you will also notice the increase in outgoings components in red at the top. These reflect the increase in outgoings over the base year. This is calculated, for example, by taking $260, the outgoings are shown in yellow on the second year and on the second bar, and deducting it from the first year's outgoings, being the first bar or the base year. So in year 2, there's a $10 increase in outgoings payable under a semi-gross lease. Now, assuming the base year remains unchanged at the $250, each subsequent year, the increase in outgoings also increase, so that in the 10th year, the increase in outgoings equates to $106. The reason it is considered to be a double up is because the grossed up rental already has an outgoings component built into it that is increasing in line with the reviews of 4%, and therefore the double up to the landlord. The impact, and I know it's a little bit confusing, but the impact over a 10-year term, assuming these assumptions, is about $500 per square meter. So it's quite a significant difference. A simple way to avoid the double up is to insist on the base year for outgoings increasing in line with the rent reviews under the lease. Traditionally, base years would only update at the exercise of option. So which one is better? Often the type of lease is guided by other leases already in operation in the building. However, what is important is the outgoings wording in the lease that you negotiate. The key things are the outgoings inclusions limited, i.e. is there an exhaustive list? Are the outgoings benchmarked, or can they be audited? Are the outgoings capped? And again, we'll touch on these a little bit later in more detail. What guarantees are there on the services and maintenance? In the next few slides, we're going to cover off the nuances in relation to the sector-specific outgoings. So the barometer here highlights the lease norms for outgoings, and they currently favour the landlord. The chart also shows the opposing perspectives, with the landlord wanting to transfer risk to the tenant to ensure outgoings are open-ended, i.e. they include unknown items in the future, and to ensure that it is unlimited and escalating a cost that transfers to the tenant. The tenant's view is the opposite, with a risk transferred back to the landlord with limited inclusions and a form of capping. It's important to note that changes in outgoings are difficult to negotiate. Sorry, John. Difficult to negotiate. However, the next few slides will talk to a selection that you can adopt in your portfolio. So the sector nuances, focusing first on office, and then we'll talk to retail and industrial. So the industry norm is that the risk is with a tenant. The industry norm is also that there's limited protections for tenants in the office space. So it's a reminder to make sure that outgoings are negotiable. You can negotiate your outgoings, albeit it can be hard. And also a reminder that the buyer or tenant beware. So we need to know what we're signing up for, even if it is unfavorable. So there's no negative surprises. We go to the next slide. Yep, thanks. So what to look out for? Sorry, one slide before. Here's a selection of examples of what to look out for. So land tax. Single holding means that the calculation is based on the subject property being the only property held by the landlord, and therefore the benefit of the tax-free threshold is applied. Furthermore, the foreign investment surcharge should also be excluded. This is a surcharge related to foreign ownership of a building. In relation to car parking, where there is an external car parking operator earning an income by letting car parking spaces to tenants within the building and external visitors, whether it be permanent or casual, the maintenance costs and arguably a proportion of the statutory charges such as land tax and council rates for the building should be paid for by the car parking operator and not the tenants within the building, which often don't utilize the car parking spaces. Management fees. Management fees are becoming very topical. The reason for this is that management fees make up a significant component of outgoings and are charged as a percentage of the total rental in the building, as opposed to actual costs incurred. It is common for costs associated with the managing of the building to be recovered under separate outgoings categories via staff costs, security, concierge, etc. Therefore, the management fees become a premium on top of the actual costs of running the building and may be a profit component to many landlords that manage the buildings in-house. To give you a feel for how much they can amount to, management costs can exceed $1 million per annum for large CBD premium office buildings. They often do not relate to the actual running costs of the building. Furthermore, the management fees are often charged by the management platforms that have an exclusive mandate to manage the buildings on behalf of investors within, say, a property trust. This means that not only are the costs not competitively tendered, the quality and accountability may also suffer. Historically, a percentage of management fee included staff and other costs in the same way that a residential real estate agent charges a percentage of rent to manage an investment property. This is often still the case. However, there appears to be a growing trend towards the latter. Vacant space is another one. So vacant space and calculation of tenants' proportion. It is important to ensure that the definition of outgoings proportion includes all lettable or net lettable areas within the building, occupied and unoccupied, tenanted or untenanted. Where the words lease space or excluding vacant space is written into the outgoings clause, that may mean that the vacant space in the building will not share in the outgoings costs, i.e. the building outgoings will be split between the tenanted spaces only, which results in high outgoings charges to the tenants of the building and a nil outgoings cost to the landlord responsible for the vacant space whilst it is being refurbished or released. And finally, leasing up costs can also be included in outgoings. This relates to the costs the landlord incurs to secure a new tenant over vacant space. Costs include management time to negotiate and document a lease with the incoming tenant, particularly where 100% of the staff costs are already recovered within outgoings. And then there's other costs, including marketing and promotion costs, leasing agents costs, and functions and events. These are all examples of outgoings components to be aware of within an office lease. I'll now hand over to Adrian to touch on the retail sector.
Thanks, Julian. Generally with retail, those tenants who fall under the Retail Leases Act in the particular state are covered and protected to a certain degree by the Act, as the Act provides definitions of what can be charged as an outgoing. Looking at some of the key concepts within retail, first, disclosure of outgoings. Before signing a lease, the landlord must provide the tenant with a disclosure statement detailing, amongst other things, all outgoings the tenant is required to pay. If an outgoing is not disclosed, the landlord cannot recover it from the tenant unless the tenant agrees in writing. Next one, limitation on recoverable outgoings. Tenants are only required to pay outgoings that are explicitly stated in the lease and disclosed or estimated properly. Landlords cannot require tenants to pay capital costs, for example, major building upgrades. And some states also restrict the recovery of land tax from retail tenants. Next one, fair apportionment of outgoings. If outgoings are shared among multiple tenants, for example, within a shopping centre, the proportion must be fair and based on lettable area or other reasonable costs. Next one being regular outgoing estimates and auditing. landlords must provide an annual estimate of outgoings. At the end of each financial year, the landlord must provide a written statement of actual outgoings certified by a qualified accountant within a specified time period. If the actual outgoings are lower than estimated, the tenant must be reimbursed. And lastly, dispute resolution. If a tenant believes they are being overcharged or unfairly treated regarding outgoings, they can seek mediation through the state-based Small Business Commissioner before taking legal action. If we move on to the next slide. So what to look out for with the outgoings within retail. So firstly, marketing and promotion. So within the disclosure statement, this needs to be carefully reviewed to ensure that the landlord does not double dip with a marketing cost that may also be part of the promotional levy that the tenant might pay for a shopping centre. Next one, leased area. So further to Julian's comments in the office sector, when leasing a space within a shopping centre or multi-tenanted premises, ensure that the area is surveyed, not just a basic plan provided with an estimate of the area. And that survey is done by the landlord at the landlord's cost. So you have a clear and correct understanding of what your proportion and amount of outgoings are. I previously had an experience where a landlord had overestimated an area and the tenant was subsequently given a reduction in both rent and outgoings accordingly. Outgoings caps. So a way to provide protection for annual increases to outgoings is to negotiate a cap on outgoings. For example, that it can't increase more than CPI. We recently had a client who received a sizable increase in outgoings, but upon them asking us to review their lease, we advised that there was a CPI cap in the lease, which saved the client over $1 million in outgoing payments over the term of the lease. Next one, building insurance. So this is becoming more of an issue, especially for retailers in standalone buildings due to the increased cost of insurance. Under a net lease where a landlord can pass the costs on to a tenant to recover, there is no motivation for a landlord to negotiate or find the best price for insurance. Including a clause that the landlord must provide 2 quotes, or that the tenant can also provide a quote and the cheaper price is accepted, is a way to ensure that there is some benchmarking of costs. Next, capital items. So these are items, as I stated before, that are usually not part of outgoings. But sometimes you can get capital items that you've got some infrastructure that is at the end of their useful life and are the responsibility of a landlord. Whilst this is common in leases, where the grey area becomes more evident is in the difference between capital upgrade versus maintenance and replacement. There are occasions where a replacement of significant components of plant and equipment within, say, lifts and air conditioning are included with outgoings, when the reality is that these items are at the end of their usable life and should be replaced as a capital item at the cost of the landlord. Including wording in your lease that the landlord is responsible for the cost to replace major components will protect your outgoings increasing due to landlords, including these under outgoings. I'll now hand over to Dylan for the industrial sector.
Thanks, Adrian. And so in the main, the same principles apply to industrial as office and other non-retail leases. The industry norm is that the risk is with the tenant and there are limited for the tenant. So no Retail Leases Act, which doesn't allow recovery of land tax, for example. So that in this case, that same reminder applies. Everything associated with outgoings can be negotiated. So whether that is a cap on outgoings for the first 1 to 3 years of a long-term lease, for example, or taking control of management of certain line items, for example. We see in the majority of cases, or a large proportion of industrial-based users, the tenant is the sole occupant and occupying the whole of the land and the building. So that does provide a little bit more scope to take control of certain line items where it might make sense for that particular business. So on the next slide, looking at the big ticket items, it would typically be worth 80 to 85% of the overall outgoings charges. These are the minimum items we would recommend including in a lease negotiation or considering carefully depending on individual circumstances. So the first is the right to object to statutory valuations on behalf of the landlord, or at least with the absolute support of the landlord. And there is generally more scope to do this in an industrial setting where the tenant is occupying the whole of the land and the building. And you can have a lot of success in proactively managing, particularly in the last few years where statutory charges have increased significantly, doubling and sometimes even tripling outgoings rates in the industrial sector. Proactively managing statutory valuations really rests with the tenant. Quite often the landlord is not necessarily incentivized to do that on your behalf. We've spoken about land tax being on a single holding basis with no absentee owner surcharge. We often have landlords try to recover land tax as it is charged to the landlord. And this means if you're a tenant who has a landlord with a portfolio of properties and who also happens to fall under the definition of an absentee owner, you're paying potentially substantially more land tax than the next tenant whose landlord might be local and only owns one property. Adrian touched on insurance and Julian on management fees. From our perspective, these should absolutely have to be justified and capped if possible. And then finally, we would also consider a clear delineation of responsibilities and obligations as critical in an industrial setting. So the outgoings line items we might choose to focus on will typically be those that are most important to that tenant. For a large proportion of industrial tenants, like we said, who occupy the whole of a land and building and not be part of a multi-tenanted building or estate, it may make more sense to take control of more line items than you typically find in a multi-tenanted situation. So whether that's site security, pest control, landscaping, and gardening, etc. So that's industrial. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. So the key takeaways. So the key takeaways is push for clear wording. It's not always easy, but it's not unreasonable and should be the industry norm. If it's not possible, then push for exclusions to be noted, foreign investment surcharge for land tax, as Dylan just mentioned, car parking maintenance where there is an external car parking operator running the building, etc. Second, avoid including but not limited to, and seek an exhaustive list of outgoings. This is difficult and not, and it's not the industry norm, but we do need to push for an exclusive list, exhaustive list, sorry. And then include the right to undertake an audit. This can be a deterrent for non-outgoings items to be included by the landlord within the outgoing statement. Can the outgoings be capped by CPI, or is there another amount? I think Dylan or Adrian mentioned that at the start of new leases, quite often the outgoings can be capped for the first couple of years, particularly where the landlord is advising the tenant that they've got an incredible ability to manage and reduce outgoings over the years. The tenant's proportion, we touched on this. Ensure that you understand what they are, how is it calculated, are you comfortable? And I think it's really important that the vacant space is included in the proportion calculation. And then finally, capital upgrades. What is it and what isn't a capital upgrade? And what we find can be quite useful here is that if the landlord has a 10-year capital upgrade plan that can be attached to the lease, it's very clear what items constitute a capital item versus a maintenance item. Thanks, Gillian. Back to you.
Thanks, Julian. All right, so we've just reached the Q&A portion of this session. So we've got a few questions that have come through. I've got two that probably tie in with each other. Have you come across estate levies and how are they treated in a commercial office lease? And then we've also had someone else ask any advice about dealing with owners' corporations.
I can maybe answer the estate levy one. A good example of an estate levy is where a developer picks up a large portion of land and there's multiple buildings built onto it. So each building will have its own building outgoings and land tax component, but the estate levy relates to the public spaces between the buildings, and Barangaroo would be a really good example of that. So the estate levy covers all those public spaces between the buildings, and there's a motivation for the landlord and the tenants to make sure that that's been kept to a certain standard, and that's what the estate levy goes towards. Probably a little bit more challenging to change what's in the estate levy, but what you can do is potentially cap the state levy amounts that are recoverable from the landlord that you're negotiating with.
And I can
yep.
attempt to answer the owners corporation question. So, a live example I'm personally working through at the moment is in a strata estate with an owners corporation, and where there's been a lot of challenges for the tenant with unclear responsibilities and obligations between the owners corporation, the landlord, and the tenant, in what should have been a much clearer situation, but over the years the lines had blurred and so forth. And so I guess it's quite a general question. So without knowing, I suppose, where exactly that is coming from, I suppose our advice is always around getting as much clarity around defining obligations, responsibilities of each party, and actually documenting them around who's responsible for specific items, procuring contracts and paying for those items, and where it makes more sense, where it makes sense for one party to do it over another, whether that's between just a tenant and a landlord or involving an owners corporation and so forth, that it's all properly documented. But that sort of clarity around obligation and so forth is critical in dealing with an owners corporation as well as a landlord.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dylan. I've got one here for probably Adrian, retail side. Can we negotiate exclusions of outgoings items set out in the disclosure statement?
Absolutely. I guess with any sector that we've talked about, there's always a negotiation that can take place to exclude specific outgoings. It's really just challenging the norms or the lease norms that landlords are expecting in terms of what outgoings they're requesting back. Especially from a retail perspective, with the shopping centre landlords, the largest shopping centre landlords, they're not prepared to negotiate with any of the standard outgoings that are paid by the rest of the tenants. It is very, very difficult to negotiate those out. But absolutely, it's always a negotiation.
Great. Another question that's come through, Julian, which method is more popular for office space, net or semi-gross, and is one better than the other?
Interestingly enough, it's very location specific as well. So Melbourne, for example, for office is mostly net leases. Brisbane historically has been gross leases with increases in outgoings. In my opinion, the more risky one for double ups, where there is a semi-gross with increases over a base year, is I would say that the net lease is more favourable to the tenant, but they both have their risks. But I think overall, most landlords are starting to head towards net leases.
Great. Another question, who bears the cost, landlord or tenant, if an audit is requested on the outgoings?
I can answer that quickly. Usually within an outgoings year, the outgoings are typically audited, and that cost falls within outgoings. However, what we're suggesting is the right to actually go deeper than that. We find that the audits don't really compare your lease provisions against the outgoings for the building. So going deeper, if that is possible, would probably be a cost that's borne by the tenant initially. Yeah.
Okay, Adrian, another retail question here. Can a shopping centre landlord charge a management fee and a centre management fee?
Well, landlords can try to charge whatever they want, in terms of an outgoing. Usually management fees are charged by landlords in a shopping centre. That's a normal fee. What was the other one? Sorry, a
Centre management fee.
centre management fee. So that may be the salaries of the centre management team that can also be recovered. But management fees, is an area where the specifics of the wording is really important to understand what is being charged and what can be excluded.
Okay, another question that's come through. Can an act apply and unapply during a lease term?
I would have thought, maybe this is more retail, Adrian, maybe more for you, but I would have thought that an act, you can't override an act. That becomes the law.
Yeah,
in the same way.
Yeah, within retail, most retail leases, there's wording that says that that if there's some inconsistencies with wording, that the act will apply, or the act will override what's in the lease.
Okay, and look, we're just over time, but one last question specific to retail lease negotiations. Can a tenant demand the lessor prepare and provide the premises survey plan at lessor's costs? In my case, most major landlords reject this request.
Absolutely. In all our offers that we have for a retail tenant, that's our standard position, that we request the landlord to undertake the survey. And in most cases they do. It obviously gets back to a negotiation, but I would strongly push for the landlord to do that at the landlord's cost.
Great. All right. Well, those were some good questions, and that wraps up our session for today. If you would like to contact any of our presenters, if you had any further questions, our details are there. And then just a reminder that our next webinar is our quarterly market update, which covers office, retail, and the industrial sectors on the 8th of May, 2025. You can sign up there on our website. Thank you, everyone.